Dan, first of all, thank you for accepting our invitation to do this interview. And I'm happy that we are in Brussels to discuss about Armenia. And I will start with, I think, the most important question. It's related to your democratic process in Armenia. What has changed in Armenia after the Belgrade Revolution, after 1.5 years almost?
First of all, thank you for the interview. It is a good chance for give some information about what is happening in a very small country, which may have some bigger significance in the world in general in terms of the movements and the change, and then what happens after a big change with the society, with the government. So the Velvet Revolution took place. It happened in Armenia as a miracle. About 1.5 years ago, and it was based solely on the people's movement. Of course, there was a leader, Nikol Pashinyan, who led the process. It was a well-educated process, educated because I think now when we look look back at the technologies that were used, we may say that the different technologies that had taken place throughout the history in many different countries, they were studied, and the technologies were picked that would have more realization and outcome in Armenia. In these terms, like marching in the regions with a small group of people, which created this desperate picture of people. Okay, you're not opposing, but we are marching in support of you to fight the oligarchy, to fight the corruption, to save the country from the clings of the corrupt criminal powers. And that was happening in the very right time when the acting Prime Minister, they were imposing changes in the legislation, so I will not go into details, but to remain on power. But when they were planning the changes, the Serge Sargsyan, then the Prime Minister, he declared that he's not going to promote himself to the elections as a candidate, but he eventually did promote himself as a candidate. He said, "Oh, it's not me, it's my party." So these little things, maybe not so little, but they were taken into a basis and were used to create this big movement, which was called Make a Step. And then another movement work was created in the middle of April on the same year in Yerevan by the young people. Mainly it was an informal movement when they said make a step and reject Serge. So in Armenian it sounds very rhythmic, it became a popular slogan, and it brought out masses of people into the streets. So the Velvet Revolution was brought to its successful outcome. And then what happened? Nikol Pashinyan was elected to be the prime minister of the country. The parliament was re-elected, and it was unusual. I think it was 75% or 77% of the Revolutionary Party. My step that made is now in the parliament. What is happening now, it's very interesting, but I'll mention a few things. I'll go back one by one. I think that society's understanding of a revolution and expectation of quick outcomes was too big, and it is still too big. And when this expectation is too big and the steps are being made very slowly, very carefully, not to break any laws, is not...
This is a very important aspect, not to break the law.
Because when Nikol Pashinyan came to the power, he said, and this notion of velvet approach to the change, people are now in the social media, in the interviews, people say, we don't want the velvet developments. We want now rigid, quick, developments in the country. But the Prime Minister's approach is that even if the laws in the country, laws allowing, the revelation of the criminal cases and the corruption, etc., even if the laws were made by the former governments, but this is what is this is what we have, and we cannot break the laws, even if the purpose there, the aim is important. So the expectations of the society for a big change, for punishing all the oligarchs, who have been stealing the public money and becoming enormously rich. They're enormously rich. It's obvious that there has taken place some corruption, but as far as you don't have proof or the criminal case in process, you cannot, there's a presumption of innocence, or you cannot create cases just for the happiness of the public.
And precedents for the
Yes.
other cases, because you will have many cases to discuss in the public.
Yes, exactly. But still, some cases are in process now. For different causes. The second president, Robert Kocharian, is under investigation. Not investigation now. Already, the court is in process. So this is what is happening. That's one thing, people's expectations versus what the changes that are taking place, and the punishment, or even the changes. There are small changes happening very quickly, and these may be very encouraging. For example, the government speaks about the money, the budgets, local budgets that have been freed from corruption. So they're now being put into the public services. For example, roads are being renovated, and the buildings, infrastructure, some schools and kindergartens, and some important aspects of the management and public administration are being improved very quickly. Those that do not depend on punishing anyone, executing anyone, etc. The budgets have been freed. So these small changes are, I wouldn't call them small, because some of the real good highways have been renovated and people are very happy with them. So we might say that the level of corruption has degraded because of, not because the system works very well, because of the fears that, the bribing will not be encouraged anymore.
And it will be punished.
Yeah, it
somehow.
May be punished, but the entire judicial system is now busy with working on the big cases. So the small cases probably will not be, there's no human resource and there's no human capacity to reflect on all of the potential corruption cases. That's why on one side there's a fear that you'll be punished or fired. On the other side, people kind of realize that the judiciary is independent, but is based on the old regimes and systems. So they are adherent to the old culture of appreciating corruption and seeing nothing extraordinary in this. So this is a very interesting process, because in some places, for example, in the healthcare system, in the hospitals, etc., there are systems where you cannot take this paying the doctors more than what is necessary or what is set by the policies. It's not even considered corruption by people. So people continue giving the doctors for the surgery because they depend on them. It's a health issue more than what is expected, and the doctors gladly take it because their salaries are low. And the salary thing is very important. There are some changes, increasing some of the social assistance allowances for the elderly or the pension, etc. But these are tiny and, to me, the ridiculous amounts. But still some changes. For example, the minimum salary in the country has increased with some about 20 euro or something per month. These things are very, these are things that are happening because the money has been freed from the hands of the manipulators. However, you cannot consider these big changes, because for the big systemic changes, the customs, the tax authorities, revenue authorities, you know, they have, for them to bring back the integrity into the system, you really have to get, and the judiciary especially, you have to get well-paid professionals so that they have something to lose, you know, in case they did something wrong. But this is not yet happening because I don't know where they could find the money to increase the salaries to the judges so that they don't rely on the bribes. That's a very, very complicated issue. That's why the government is looking for various ways of, you know, reforming the system so that, you know, so that these type of mechanisms are embedded into the system to fight the corruption substantially. So this is approximately what's happening. Another thing that is in the process, and this may be true to any country that has gone through a revolution, there is well-educated, especially some young people, professionals in the country who may be brilliant professionally, but the management, you know, managing budget, managing an institution like a ministry, for example, or a department in the ministry, managing a change. So I would symbolically call it the project management, which, for example,
the opposition of the former political system to those changes that you are expecting now from civil society.
Yes, yes. But most of the people who have any management skills were in the civil society. So those who go from the civil society, you could say they know how to set up a goal and achieve a result. You know, have a plan in place, work with people, make people work. But the ministries, the government agencies, most of their staff, you know, 70% of the staff is from the old times, where the expectations were absolutely different. These were people who were granted, gifted positions because of, you know, as a favor. They weren't expected much. I hate to generalize because there have been people who have been doing some great work, but there is an average kind of rank of officials there. And this, from the words of the officials that had been appointed and then were released, it is obvious that they said it was absolutely impossible to work. The expectations there from the parliament, from the government, from the prime minister's office are very high to achieve, for example, in the Ministry of Education, let's say, to come up with reforms, etc. But the staff that is there is not capable of doing things. Some of the staff, for example, the support staff, executive staff, they're not even capable of typing up a plan, following up with a plan, making a change, gathering people to consultations, inviting civil society here, you know, setting up public councils to discuss things and then generate solutions from such discussions. These are things that the governments are lacking. But without this, it is not. It is impossible to achieve the results that the public desires and that are based on the public's best interest and the professionals' best interest. Contrary to this, a lot of meetings are being organized, but professionals have been consolidated into trying to help the government to come up with the best education reform, the best healthcare, social sector reforms, etc. But what is happening that the government staff that organizes all of this, they kind of are not able to generate a material from those consultations that would be in the basis of their reforms. So it's like a scattered, a random process of professionals trying to help the government and governments coming up with something. So, but in some cases, it's rather planned and well-structured process. For example, in the healthcare system. But on the other cases, the public interest
this
is...
Brownian movement of
yes,
the
yes,
things.
very much so. Civil society's interest is there to help the government in any way they can. For example, my organization organized a CSO strategizing event, and we discussed about 11 themes and topics, how CSOs can help the governments to quickly implement the reforms or what to take into their agenda in the future.
This will be my next question, because my next question, I saw a lot of dignity in the streets last year. I mean, during April-May 2018 period of time, and I saw a lot of participation from civil society part, a lot of involvement, a lot of support for the government after that. How civil society reinvented herself, because you were in a standby process until the elections, until those changes that happened in Armenia. And this is a very important question, because I can see a lot of common issues in the region, in the Black Sea region, I mean, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova right now. And it's important to explain what was your experience in the field.
Civil society, it's interesting. Civil society's expectations are civil society, as opposed to the general public, had a better understanding what the reform process is and how difficult it is, and the rule of law should be the key rather than happiness of the public over punishing someone or firing someone, etc. So rule of law was an important thing that the civil society kind of adheres to, understanding why the government is so slow in its reform processes. Civil society's expectation that the dialogue with the government will open up immediately, this is what was a little bit not satisfied so quickly, say, because the government was too busy. Most of the young government staff were their friends, close allies of the people, of the civil society officials, not officials, but civil society representatives. So if you want to have a meeting, or if you want to discuss something, you use your kind of friendship and ties to reach to them to order. But because of the enormous amount of work that had poured into the shoulders of the new government, they of course were not always open to new ideas. First, you have to implement what's on the table already. So every new idea means a new initiative, new project, new plan. And there's no human resource to implement this, and there's no money in the government to jump into new things. So this obligation of fulfilling the plan that is already on the table. But civil society still open. There's many opportunities. The process by all the ministers is set up to invite civil society organizations to participate in the public councils. They've set up the councils. So this dialogue is taking place. The issue is how the civil society's participation in the public councils, bodies, in the discussions, how is it taken into consideration in the plans? That is where we have a gap, because many civil society organization representatives that take part in the discussions. We, for example, are a member of Police Council, and we are a member of Justice, Minister of Justice's Public Council. In some cases, it's very constructive. They listen to civil society's recommendations, etc. And then, in some cases, it's almost formal. You just had a mark there that we did a public hearing, and that's all. In this case,
so the dialogue is formal.
Yes, in some cases it's formal. But civil society organizations, they have a dual, a contradictory feeling now when we talk. On one hand, you should support the revolution to kind of move forward, the reforms to take place, support the government. But on the other hand, who else, if not the civil society, should be watchdogging following that the government meets the standards of, the ethical behavior, non-corruption, free of conflict of interest cases, where there is nepotism utilized or not. So it is still the civil society's role. So on one hand, you want to trust the government. On the other hand, you want to oversee the government, and the government says, okay, we are a revolutionary government. Why do you want to criticize us? But there is still a huge ground for criticism in very small issues. Sometimes in the procurement processes, for example. So the civil society does kind of reveal these things, and it was easier before because the government was not, they were open with civil society, but there was no pressure on civil society in the old regime. They were very smart and soft with the civil society, but the government was doing whatever they wanted. They never
just
cared.
to look good in front of the foreign partners.
Yes, they never cared, never did. So you could discuss a legislation, and then the draft would go into the parliament in an absolutely different form and be ratified anyway. And in this case, they are more serious and more constructive with civil society. Therefore, the civil society feels it's almost like you have to criticize the family member all the time. That's the feeling, but you have to criticize to keep up the standards. You have to, maintain the standards of non-corruption, anti-corruption, and the good governance, and the social justice, and, communicate this, communicate the needs of the public to the government, so that, anyway, it's a little bit closer process now between government and civil society.
And more productive.
Yes, more productive, and some ministries have opened up grant systems for the NGOs also. Some procurement processes and services have been now transferred to the CSOs, but not so fast, and it hasn't gone too far yet. But those processes will continue. This is one thing. The other thing is that the civil society capacity to help the government is not that big. We need a more professional civil society, understanding the data, understanding the legislative processes, the government processes, the decision-making processes, so that they make use of all the opportunities and mechanisms and be constructive rather than go talk, discuss, and then come back. The civil society lacks this capacity of real hardcore advocacy. And this is what is needed right now.
But this is again a common phenomenon in the Black Sea area. I mean, I can find those elements in Moldova, I can find those elements in Georgia right now, and I can find in Belarus, I can find in Ukraine somehow. And you have mentioned some problems, and there are important problems, such as lack of financial resources, lack of human resources. You have this demographic problem also, as in Moldova. You can find we have lost 1/3 of our population in almost 30 years. But what are your priorities that you are putting in front of your government now? The priorities of the civil society, how do you define them?
It's a very good question, but the civil society itself hasn't been consolidated to present the priorities to the government. And because civil society in a randomized way is trying, based on their own profile of operation, to work with this government, work with that group of government professionals to do something. But civil society does not have a general agenda. It hasn't been consolidated, and that's a very good question. It actually gives a ground for thinking. And civil society, by its profile, it's very different in Armenia. Some of, for example, field organizations, we can calculate maybe 10, 20 organizations that have advocacy power, a good watchdog power, well educated in terms of the policies and public administration and advocacy processes, and with a good record of successful legislative amendments or legislative processes. But civil society is very different. For example, in rural areas, civil society is more diluted, dissolved with public. You know, they just, in most of the cases, it's more like the needs that they convey, the needs of the people, the needs of the communities, people in poverty, people with disabilities, etc. To follow that these needs move up and become part of the legislative discussion or a reform context, this is yet not taking place. Because I think what is happening in civil societies themselves, the thematic groups and the thematic networks, clusters, they haven't consolidated to formulate their own 10 themes, for example. They say priorities of the sector. And very often the government says, okay, your agenda is the same as ours. So why oppose and why do two separate things? Come take part in the public discussions, etc. And they may be right, because they are now more interested in the quick change and increasing the level of the social justice in Armenia, social protection, health protection, healthcare. But that's a good question. The civil society itself hasn't been formed into, you know, a kind of a unified power with a unified message and 10 priorities for the government to say, look, here is what needs to be done strategically in various areas, and we're here to help you. That is not taking place.
But you still have those platforms to discuss different issues, different
Yes.
policy proposals.
Yes, because there is many programs going on, even if they don't have part of in their agenda to get together, discuss, but there is various platforms and discussions on various issues that are urgent for the society. For example, the domestic violence issue, the gender equality issue, the discrimination, and some human rights issues have been put on hold during the revolution because of a lot of the manipulative power of the former regimes to affect people's brains and dispose them against the acting government. You know, by spreading fake news, fake value threats, that what the new government is doing, the pro-European standards, etc. They are all against the traditional Armenian value systems. And there's these things happening. That's why the government, I think, is very, very cautious now about some of the acute human rights issues, because they know what is the public's, what kind of information has been fed to public. So they're very cautious in, you understand this is a controversial process. On one hand, you want to be a fully independent and country with all the standards, etc. But on the other hand, you know, you try not to speak up about this, not to be too vocal about this, so that the public doesn't lose trust and doesn't believe more into this propaganda that is fed by the former regime's media. And they're very rich. They put a lot of money. If you look at the internet-based media in Armenia, their number has jumped to the clouds, and there's the media and the social media is working on the public now to distort this image of, you know, the new government, you know, about all these conspiracy theories that he was brought to power to destroy Armenia.
They are still very powerful.
Yes, they're very powerful. A lot of money is being put in the fake news and manipulative news structure. And that's a very dangerous situation. For example, recently, the Ministry of Culture had given out some grants, and one of the grants was about a documentary about a former weightlifting athlete who had been a woman, and then he was transgender, so he you know, he turned into a man, so he was telling his story, how difficult it had been. It's his life path. And then there was huge misunderstanding in the public. Why should this be promoted in Armenia? However, it was not promoted. It was just one story to show that being transgender is a very difficult thing in terms of public acceptance, your own feelings.
The struggle of
the struggle internal. So he had to go do surgery, become a guy. And he, of course, doesn't live in Armenia. Anyway, but he had been a champion and in weightlifting, she had been a champion and she had brought a lot of medals. So Nicole Pashinyan publicly said, Mel, Meline was the name of the girl, and then he said, Mel is under my protection directly. So don't you dare criticize a person who has been struggling because of a problem. And it was very brave, because public is fed by this as if the new government is trying to promote, this type of things, transgender people, that this is against the Armenian family values, etc. But the issue is that people are just trying to present the difficulty, the hardships of minority populations are going through.
This is only one example, but we have also some protests related to the Istanbul Conventions during the last month.
Istanbul Convention is another interesting thing. In the entire Istanbul Convention, there's not a single word about a family, type of family, like being a gay couple or a lesbian couple, whatever. There's nothing about that in Istanbul Convention, except there's there a notion that says that a family or a family unit, which means you don't have to be registered to be a family, but you can live with your civic partner and be in so-called civil marriage. But this one small item was taken and manipulated in the General Avenue in Armenia, and in Northern Avenue. There's a table sitting and the guys collecting signatures and speaking on the microphones about Istanbul Convention, that this government is going to destroy Armenian family values by Istanbul Convention. So the attention is taken away from the domestic violence issue, the issue of women being killed in the families by the close family members, this issue of girls being beaten, or because it's a huge majority of all the cases that were murdered. So the attention is being taken, and it's a very well organized process, and public get in the trap of this propaganda because it's very clear, the message is clear. All they want, the Istanbul Convention is about opening up families to be gay and lesbian families, where there is not a single word about it. But
the debate is not about that.
The debate is not about that, and it's so easy to demonstrate to public that the public is very vulnerable. So as a civil society, what we have to do, we have to find comprehensive ways to working with the public, to protecting the government when there is the positive changes and reforms happening, and providing this dialogue. And it's very difficult, very, very difficult, because then the public takes up what is more comprehensive to their own minds, and sometimes what is dear to their hearts. So these processes are taking place. Everything is very, very complicated right now to me. My major concern is that this issue of strong, powerful, constructive leaders that should join the government. But as a whole, I must say that the civil society right now is more powerful than the government sometimes. That's the feeling that you get, because we as civil society organizations, we do not stop. We do not, we don't look at the funding. continue growing, organizing meetings, discussing issues, developing a message for the government, and working with people, with young people. So if there is, I think, this kind of manipulations, fake news emerging, etc., happening, what we do, we organize these media literacy schools, how to recognize fake news, how to understand the messages of the different kinds of people on power, how to analyze and find who is the founders of this media and what the message then intends to do with the public.
The approach is more related on those elements of critical thinking
Yes.
processes.
Yes, and we even have a publication on the critical thinking.
We can find the publication on your webpage.
It's in Armenian, but it's a manual. It has exercises even that gives you ways to analyze the text and go deeper.
So it's an internal document it's focused on your experience.
Yeah, it is in Armenian. Yeah, we disseminate it widely, but we also organize meetings with young people. So it is, but overall, I think people are still glad that the former regime is destroyed, that the new developments are obvious. Media is trying, the good media. There is only a few, maybe 10 or 12 media outlets that I would say are independent.
Mm-hmm.
Some public TV channels are even owned still by the old regime people. So when you turn on the TV, you have a feeling that you're, in the old times. The other thing is that the people were following very closely what was happening in the government, but I think they're losing that gist now. They kind of, not so interested anymore. But some important developments that are taking place, for example, Nicole Pashinyan's participation in the, the international networks which Armenia is a member of. Like how he deals, increases Armenian authority among, for example, the Eurasia Economic Union members. And these things that are taking place, they may not be visible to the public eye, but they may speak about the fact that, on one hand, Armenia has neighbors that has to deal with, and has these networks. He's not destroying any of the networks. There's no abrupt moves out of these networks. But at the same time, you see that there is this strong will to increase Armenia's authority and to take Armenia off this pressure system that was before, because its position was weakened. Pretty much.
You have mentioned those elements that showed that Armenian civil society reinvented herself. What is your partnership with the foreign donors, with foreign institutions, I mean European Union, DG NEAR, Eastern Partnership, Civil Society Forum? Are they more aware of your national needs, or their approach is a regional one? So they stick only to those recommendations that are made on Brussels, or they hear you, the voice of the civil society?
I think the international donors, in the first place, after the revolution, they hurried to find out, so what are the needs now? Because
you have a lot of financial support from the EU delegation in Armenia.
Not a lot. We are hearing that this support will be growing in the future, but I think the international assistance organizations like the EU and the donors, they were caught a little bit off guard by uncertainty. Mm-hmm. The government was new. People were new. They didn't know what the donors have already provided. They didn't know what was happening in the governments, and the the donors wanted to learn very quickly how they need to direct their support. And in these terms, there was a lot of uncertainty, and they were going around and asking, so does Armenia need? And the ministries didn't have the answer. But then now I think it's becoming more and more clear that the judiciary reform, for example, police capacity building for police and police reform is a priority, some healthcare system items, and I think they are now becoming part of the agenda. As for the working with CSOs, there is a lot of consultations. For example, there is the SEPA agreement between the European Union and Armenia. And I think CSOs take very active part in the discussion of SEPA and the milestones and the roadmap, how it should be implemented. And I think there is more clarity now from the donor side, what they need to direct their resources into.
So this 1.5 years were useful for them also, not only for Armenian society.
Yes.
To reconnect again.
Yeah, to reconnect, and we organized a visit by the European and the US politicians in Armenia right after the revolution last September. This was a project of Black Sea Trust and the German Marshall Fund. And so it was a group of journalists and politicians working in various spheres. They talked with the government and they also talked with the opposition to find out what's, because we organized it in a balanced way so that they could hear various perspectives. And I think these things were crucial to understand the position of Armenia in regard of its own needs, internal needs, also in regard of the external messages and external policies. Because Armenia has a huge issue of the Nagorno-Karabakh unresolved conflict, which remains #1 priority for the country. It's a priority for the citizens because you want peace, you want, but this is an issue that will never have a quick resolution. But the way this conversation is taking place, I think I personally like there's a change in the perspectives, and I personally like how Armenian government and even Azerbaijani governments are treating the issue. There's some slight changes happening in the mode of the glossary and conversation about the issue. Or, for example, recently there was an exchange of journalists that took place. Armenian journalists were invited to Azerbaijan to speak with some authorities, and that was a very brave and great move. It hadn't taken place within the last 10 years at least. So these things give me a message that there's an opening there. And I think it gives a good ground for international donor agencies also to open up more support for these type of initiatives, because the internal economic justice system issues, the public administration issues are very important, but the external relations and the huge problem of the conflict between the two countries and supporting those processes are sometimes more important, because these may bring change internally also, because that's the #1 hanging issue over the populations of both Azerbaijan and Armenia, and of course Nagorno-Karabakh.
And it's important to notice here that it's not something usual that is happening between the neighbors.
Yes, it's not usual. People are still being shot on the border. Nagorno-Karabakh is developing, Artsakh is developing as a republic by itself. Its population has all the systems and structures in place, and they're working on themselves as a country, even although they're not recognized. However, there is no international support, not enough international support in the peace processes, at least at the track 2 diplomacy levels. But the track 2 may very well lead to the track 1. When people see that, the hostility among populations is decreasing, that militaristic views from the education structure, from the news structure is fading out. That would be good indicators to show that, the public one now can have more dialogue into more gradual resolution processes.
I would like to end this discussion, a very interesting discussion, on a positive note, and I would like to ask you, what are your wishes for your Armenian civil society?
For the civil society, my number one wish is that civil society is, speaking of the language of the civil society, Armenia's financial sustainability of the civil society remains number one issue. So it's a very difficult process. Strive for resources and strive for the change. So longer term programs are necessary for the civil society. 3 to 5 years, not 9 months to 18 months projects, which donors often consider luxury.
To think on long terms.
Yes, to
projects.
plan longer term programs, to plan longer term constructive change with the governments and engaging the private sector, engaging the public, educating the public, so that the public does not become a client receiving a service, but the public becomes a constructive element of the government, managing the government strategies, feeding back into the government what public services need to be changed, etc. My second thing is that as a civil society organization, we would like to see a consolidated work, well-managed work between the government, the public sector, and also the donor organizations, so that for us the most difficult thing is a clear message and a clear goal. You have a clear message and a clear goal, it's very easy to plan how you achieve it. For example, in the sector of education in Armenia, if you look at the sector, you would think that there is no problems, but there is so many problems happening there. At the level of teachers, at the level of parents, there's the textbooks, the message that the textbooks give, etc. They are outdated in a way. So I would like to see this civil society perspective that is more advanced in terms of what the universal values are for the prosperity of the humans, inherited into the government reform systems and then translated and communicated with public, so that the public is supportive of the processes and does not see threats, in every little move that you're trying to make.
Thank you, Gayane, and I would like to wish you again, and for you and for organization Eastern Partnership Foundation from Eurasia Partnership Foundation from Armenia, Happy New Year and Merry Christmas.
Angela,
and I
Happy
hope
New
to
Year
see you
too.
soon, not only for official events,
Yes.
but also for some trips in the field to research some processes.
Actually, we would like to, yes. But if you come to Armenia, please let us know. We can organize some, can meet with some people and talk on the ground. But the number of issues is immense. And, before you were not even hearing about this. Now the government is open. You hear about this huge number of issues. And the country's security systems need reform, the police needs reform, justice system. Constitutional court is in a crisis, in a deep crisis now because of the regulations. You cannot change the members. So these are the members that are residing there, and any major resolution goes to constitutional court and is stuck there. So there are so many blocks on this roadway that they have to be removed, but step by step.
We will definitely continue our discussion in the near future. And again, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Yes, thank you, Angela. Merry Christmas to you too.